Hi, this is Psychology from My Kitchen. I am Mrs. Ryan from Sylvania Northview High School, and in today's episode, we are going to have our last installment in Unit 1, History and Approaches, and we are going to be talking about the careers in psychology. So in our previous videos, we have established that psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental process. We talked about the history of how we kind of got there. We looked at these different perspectives and how we're asking and answering our questions about why do we do the things that we do. But today we're looking at kind of a practical piece about psychology, and that is what happens if I decide to become a psychologist, and what is that process? So I'm going to throw out a caveat right away in that I, Sarah Ryan, am not a psychologist. I know. I get it from my students all the time. They ask questions about, like what school I went to and things like that, which I did, a master's degree. But my degrees are in education. I am a licensed educator, specifically for social studies instruction. But I teach about psychology, and I teach this introductory course. So no, I am not a psychologist, but I do know what they do. And so today we're going to talk about the different fields of psychology and what it would mean to get there. So interestingly enough, in the United States, psychology is actually the #2 major behind business for students in looking at what kind of careers and stuff like that they would go into. But just simply getting a bachelor's degree in psychology doesn't make you a psychologist. In order to be a psychologist, you have to have a doctorate degree. And that, of course, means more schooling. So there are a lot of fields that a person who has a bachelor's degree in psychology might go into. For example, a lot of business, so like human resources and things like that, that psychology is going to be very beneficial for. As a teacher, I also took psychology classes in college. So there's a lot of different areas that I might go into with just a bachelor's degree. But if I wanted to become a psychologist, I have to get a doctorate degree, which typically takes somewhere around 6 to 8 years in order to complete. So just a heads up, lots of school. So if I were to ask you to imagine a psychologist in your mind, so picturing something in your mind's eye, I would guess that you picture someone who is speaking to another individual. They might be facing each other. Somebody might be like laying on a couch or something like that. But they're talking about their problems. And it might specifically deal with like mental illness or something, which is fine. There are psychologists who do that. But that's not actually what a lot of psychology is about. So if you were to become a psychologist, a lot of people who go into psychology actually are going to complete research, that they are going to probably teach psychology classes, that they want to conduct research into the questions they have about human behavior. And so a lot of psychologists are actually found in the academic world. So they work for colleges and universities, and the way that they get paid to do their research is in exchange for teaching classes to like undergraduates and things like that. But their research then might go on to be published, and they also might go into like speaking and things like that. So a lot of psychologists actually go into kind of the academic field. You also get a proportion that are going to go into therapy and counseling, so that they might have like a private practice or something like that. And there is a difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. So we're going to talk about that here in just a second. So If you were to decide to become a psychologist, one of the things that you would declare is what kind of psychologist that you would want to become. And our different types of psychologists are based on the major type of research that they are going to be engaged in. And that research is going to fall into one of two categories, what is known as basic research versus applied research. So there's a series of psychologists who are much more likely going to engage in what's known as basic research. Basic research is going to be conducting research on topics in which you are interested in and you want to gain more knowledge about, but they're not necessarily going to solve problems or be some kind of groundbreaking work. It's more about simply being curious about human behavior and wanting to know more about that human behavior, and then of course being able to speak on it and publish about it. But it's something that we just want to know more about. We want to know more about that particular topic. So we could take something like parenting. Okay, I am a parent myself. I have a lovely 5-year-old daughter. Okay, um, most people, if they become parents, they want to become good parents, right? So I might look at a question of, are men or women better parents? So that's a really broad and general kind of question. Some people might think that they automatically know the answer to that question. But again, this is why we do research. We don't make, certain assumptions. So that might be an element of basic research. I'm curious, what makes a good parent? How do men and women approach parenting differently? Does it seem that a certain gender is better at parenting than another? Those are really general, broad questions that would encompass something that we would think of as basic research. So this is a series of psychologists who are more likely going to conduct basic research. And we start with our biological psychologist. A person who's a biological psychologist is looking specifically at the biology of the human body and how that is going to affect behavior. So this might be someone who is looking at uh, hormonal levels, or they might look at something like drugs and the effect of drugs on the brain as a biological component. How might that affect somebody? So they're looking at links between biological elements of the mind and how that influences subsequent behavior. So, for example, we know that people who display really aggressive behaviors in adulthood, so somebody who might have what we call anger management problems, we can actually do research on the brain and see that that person has a decreased level of brain activity in the area of their brain that sits right behind the forehead. And so that's something that a biological psychologist might be doing research in. A developmental psychologist, they have a fun little nickname that they talk about, and this is studying human beings through the lifespan, through development, or we say that they study people from womb to tomb. A lot of developmental psychology, especially in the early days, were all about children. Okay, um, things like what kind of books to read to kids, how much activity should children have, how much should they be held, what are their language capabilities. These are all things that developmental psychologists would be curious about, right? We're interested in how is it that humans start out and their experiences, how does that affect them into adulthood? But the thing about developmental psychology, it is from womb to tomb, okay? We continue to develop all throughout our lives. There isn't a stopping point until the day that we die. And so newer pieces to developmental psychology are actually really getting interested into geriatrics and people who are older adults, the importance of things that happen in older adulthood. How do we how do we engage older adults? How do we make lifestyles that continue to be productive and fulfilling later in adulthood? That's something that developmental psychologists would also study, and this can be helpful to older adults in understanding more practical problems that might happen down the line, even though this is somebody who's still doing basic research. Other psychologists who are going to engage in basic research are cognitive psychologists. These are people who create experiments that deal with the way that we think, how we perceive the world around us, how do we remember things. Cognitive psychology can also be about like how I misremember information. So like I think I remembered it one way, but it actually happened in another. So cognitive psychology is all about how I process information, how do I problem solve, what's going to be typical of a lot of human beings and what might be atypical from human beings. An educational psychologist. So you all, of course, are engaged in education. That's why you're listening to me talk right now. But in educational psychology, we actually study effective ways for students to learn. And this can be things like how much talking takes place, how to create increased engagement. You might have heard, for example, that there are learning styles like I'm a visual learner, or I'm an auditory learner, or I'm kinesthetic. None of those things are true. Like there aren't different learning styles. Instead, we actually know that what increases the likelihood that a student is going to learn something is how engaged they are, which arguably is really kind of difficult when you're talking about remote or virtual learning. And so that's why educational psychologists are going to help uh, develop ways in which we can teach students better and what's going to make for good education. Um, Personality psychologist. A personality psychologist is, of course, all about different types of personality traits. What are common personality traits? What are personality traits that might be problematic? All kinds of things. So there's, and of course, in this class, we'll talk more about personality and have a little personality tests and things like that. So those are going to be some of my basic research. And then we get to social psychologists. So in psychology, we have what's known as social psychology, not to be confused with sociology. Those are two separate things. So one, sociology is going to be the scientific study of groups of people. So sociologists might study individuals who come from urban areas, or they might study people based off of their socioeconomic status and look at like differences in behavior, education levels, incomes, all that kind of thing. But that's what sociologists do. They study groups of people. Whereas a social psychologist is a psychologist who's interested in how other people influence my individual behavior. So how is it that people change their behavior when they are by themselves as opposed to when they are around groups of people? Doesn't matter how many people are they around? Does it matter if they're really good friends or if they're all people they don't know? How does that influence their decision making or their aggression? These are all things that a social psychologist is going to look at. Now, a person who's engaged in psychometrics is somebody who's dealing with all of the data that is collected from different types of experimentation. So for some people curious about different types of mathematics and their importance, Psychology actually has very strong ties to statistics and statistical analysis. And so people who look at the data that is collected, how it's collected, how I might analyze it, they might be involved in this psychometrics piece. So then we get to applied research. And in applied research, different from basic research, is that I have a very specific problem that I need to solve. Okay, there is something that is happening and I need to change that. And I need to use psychology to help change human behavior, probably for the better, or to make something work better for human beings. So that is a real world kind of problem. And the following psychologists are much more likely going to engage in those real world, something that I need to deal with right now kinds of problems using psychology. And one place that you see this happening all the time is somebody who is known as an IO, or industrial organizational psychologist. Industrial organizational psychologists work hand in hand with the business world and in all kinds of different businesses. But this is somebody who is applying what we know about human behavior to different elements of business. So this might be like in a workplace setting. You have a company that is looking to improve productivity for their workers. What are things that they can do? An IO psychologist might come in and make recommendations about the workspace. How is the office laid out? What kind of furniture do people have? What kind of colors are even on the walls? You might look at it from a consumer perspective. A lot of software needs to, and hardware for that matter, needs to have a psychologist input into making things more user friendly. For example, I am old enough to know about early computers. And I remember when I was in middle school, my computer teacher was really upset about a mouse. She thought that everyone should just know the computer codes that you type in and to make commands occur on a computer. But that's really hard for people to do. And so something like a hardware, like a mouse, this was not something that was part of early computing. And then you get into things like a touch screen and how a touch screen is laid out. Like that is something that an IO psychologist who understands human behavior might work with a company or working with a business to create products that work for human beings. So you have like the engineering piece where I get a lot of students who, they're interested in becoming engineers, all that kind of stuff, building stuff. That's awesome. But if people don't know how to use what it is that you're building, how is that going to be beneficial? How are you going to sell your product? So there's a lot of ties in IO psychology with businesses, and they can also end up making quite a bit of money if they get into the right business. Along those same lines is a subfield of IO psychology, which is known as human factors. And in human factors psychology, we look at the engineering in something that's known as ergonomics, particularly of products that are being used by human beings. So for example, you might think about like the design of a car, and more specifically, the sounds that your car makes. Have you ever really thought about the sounds that your car makes? Does it make different sounds when you enter the car? Does it make sounds if your seatbelt's not on, or if a door is locked, or if you leave your lights on when you exit the car? What about things like voice command or where your console is and how it works? Those are all things that have to be designed with how a human operates. And sometimes we don't always do a super great job at that. We don't always design uh, cars or public spaces with different human beings in mind. So it's thinking about how to make physical environments safer. So you think about like people who have different types of disabilities. How do we make a world safer for persons with disability? How do we make spaces better for both men and women? Interestingly enough, a lot of human factor psychology with that engineering component don't include a lot of women. And so, for example, women are actually less likely to be in car accidents,